The settlement records of Pine Ridge Valley, West Virginia, present one of the most disturbing case studies in Appalachian family dynamics ever documented. What began as a routine genealogical investigation in 1995 uncovered a pattern of systematic terror that spanned nearly a century, orchestrated by a single bloodline whose methods of control redefined the boundaries between civilization and savagery. The Granger family first appeared in Pike County records in 1898, though their origins remain deliberately obscured. Unlike typical mountain settlers who arrived with possessions and traceable histories, the Grangers materialized during a particularly harsh winter with nothing but an intimate knowledge of the region's hidden resources and an unsettling ability to predict exactly when neighboring families would need their assistance. Samuel Granger, the family patriarch, possessed an uncanny talent for arriving at homesteads precisely when tragedy struck. When the Henderson family's eldest son fell through river ice, Samuel appeared with ropes and medical supplies before anyone had sent for help. When blight destroyed the Morrison crop, he arrived with enough grain to last the winter, asking for nothing in return. These acts of providence established him as an indispensable figure in the isolated community. But former residents who escaped the valley years later described a different reality entirely. What appeared to be supernatural intuition was actually the result of meticulous planning and deliberate sabotage. Samuel and his 3 sons had spent months studying each family's routines, identifying vulnerabilities, and creating the very emergencies they would later solve. The Henderson boys' accident occurred after someone had deliberately weakened the ice where children commonly played. The Morrison blight was the result of contaminated seeds Samuel had provided the previous spring, mixed with just enough healthy grain to avoid immediate suspicion. The family's compound, built on a plateau overlooking the entire valley, served as both fortress and observatory. From this elevated position, they could monitor every family's daily activities through field glasses, noting when men left for hunting trips, when women traveled to neighboring settlements, and when children wandered beyond parental supervision. This intelligence network allowed them to orchestrate their interventions with remarkable precision, gradually positioning themselves as the valley's unofficial protectors while simultaneously engineering the threats they claimed to guard against. By 1903, the Grangers had achieved something unprecedented in Appalachian social structure: complete dependence. Every family in Pine Ridge Valley owed them debts that could never be repaid, favors that created unbreakable obligations, and gratitude that masked growing terror. The few families who attempted to leave discovered that their debts followed them, collected through methods that defied legal or rational explanation. The Wilkins family's attempted departure in 1904 became a cautionary tale that prevented future escape attempts. After loading their possessions and announcing their intention to relocate to Charleston, they made it exactly 12 miles before their wagon broke down. When they sought help at a nearby settlement, they were informed that Samuel Granger had already arrived to collect on debts the family didn't remember incurring. Documents bearing their signatures, written in handwriting they swore wasn't theirs, detailed loans for emergency medical care, borrowed livestock, and protection services stretching back years. More disturbing were the testimonials from neighbors claiming the Wilkins family had stolen tools, spoiled wells, and threatened children. These accusations came from people who had never met the Wilkins family, living in communities 50 miles away, yet they spoke with conviction about specific incidents they claimed to have witnessed. The family returned to Pine Ridge Valley that same evening, and neighbors noted that they moved and spoke differently afterward, as though something essential had been drained from them. The Granger sons each specialized in different aspects of their family's control system. Marcus, the eldest, managed what they called education services, establishing a school that ostensibly provided children with basic literacy while actually indoctrinating them into complete submission to Granger authority. Children who attended his classes returned home with extensive knowledge of their neighbors' private conversations, family secrets, and hidden resources, creating a network of juvenile informants that penetrated every household in the valley. Gabriel, the middle son, oversaw community protection, organizing patrols that supposedly guarded against external threats while actually monitoring residents' compliance with increasingly arbitrary rules. His men carried weapons and wore crude uniforms that gave them an official appearance, though they answered to no legitimate authority. These patrols conducted regular searches of homes under the pretense of security inspections, confiscating items deemed dangerous or unnecessary, gradually stripping families of their independence and ability to resist. The youngest son, Silas, managed spiritual guidance, establishing religious services that blended traditional mountain Christianity with practices that seemed designed to break down individual will. His sermons emphasized themes of submission, collective responsibility, and the dangers of independent thought. He introduced rituals involving group confessions where residents were encouraged to reveal their private doubts and fears, information that was carefully documented and later used to manipulate and control them. The truly horrifying aspect of the Granger operation was its sustainability. Unlike other criminal families who relied on violence and intimidation, the Grangers created a system where victims policed themselves. Residents lived in constant fear of disappointing their benefactors, competing to demonstrate their loyalty and gratitude. Children informed on their parents, spouses betrayed each other's confidences, and neighbors fought for the privilege of serving the family that had enslaved them. This psychological architecture reached its peak during what locals called the choosing ceremonies, annual events where the Grangers selected families to receive special honors. These ceremonies, held during the winter solstice, involved elaborate rituals where residents competed to demonstrate their worthiness through increasingly degrading displays of submission. Winners received additional food, better housing, and protection from the family's displeasure, while losers faced months of subtle punishment that included social isolation, reduced food rations, and assignment to the most dangerous work details. The physical evidence of the Granger system remained hidden until a 1962 archaeological survey uncovered a network of underground chambers beneath their compound. These spaces, connected by tunnels that extended throughout the valley, contained detailed records of every resident's activities, fears, and relationships. File cabinets held thousands of documents, including surveillance reports, psychological profiles, and strategic plans for maintaining control over multiple generations. Most disturbing were the medical records describing experiments conducted on residents under the guise of treatment. The Grangers had established themselves as the valley's medical authorities, treating everything from broken bones to difficult births. Their records reveal systematic studies of pain tolerance, psychological manipulation techniques, and methods for inducing specific forms of mental illness. They had turned their entire community into a laboratory for perfecting systems of human control. The system finally collapsed in 1943 when a flash flood damaged the tunnels and exposed some of the underground chambers. A traveling minister named Jacob Morrison, seeking shelter during the storm, discovered the hidden records and managed to escape the valley with evidence of the Grangers' activities. His testimony to state authorities triggered an investigation that found the valley completely abandoned, with no trace of the Granger family or their victims. The official report classified the incident as a mass migration caused by economic hardship, but investigators' private notes tell a different story. They found evidence of recent habitation, including warm food and still burning fires, but no people. Bloodstains covered the floors of several buildings, and personal belongings were scattered as though people had fled in panic. Most unsettling was the discovery of a mass grave containing remains that carbon dating later revealed to be centuries old, despite being buried in clothing from the 1940s. Modern researchers attempting to verify these accounts face unusual obstacles. Pine Ridge Valley appears on historical maps but cannot be located using contemporary GPS systems. Satellite imagery shows nothing but unbroken forest where the settlement supposedly existed. County records contain detailed information about the Granger family's activities, but list them as occurring in a location that current geography cannot accommodate. The few elderly residents of surrounding areas who claim knowledge of Pine Ridge Valley provide contradictory accounts. Some describe it as a prosperous community that mysteriously vanished overnight. Others insist it was always a cursed place that drove people mad with isolation and fear. A handful of individuals claiming to be descendants of valley families occasionally surface in regional genealogical databases, but attempts to interview them inevitably result in their disappearance before meetings can be arranged. What remains certain is that the Granger family developed and implemented a system of control so comprehensive and effective that it erased itself from historical record while leaving behind only fragments of evidence too disturbing to ignore. Their legacy serves as a reminder that in the isolated hollows of Appalachia, human nature's darkest impulses could flourish unchecked, creating pockets of horror that challenge the very concept of civilization. The documentation suggests that the Grangers understood something profound about the psychology of isolated communities, that people will surrender their freedom gradually in exchange for the illusion of security, and that the most effective prison is one where the inmates believe they are free. In Pine Ridge Valley, they created a perfect model of this principle, a community so thoroughly controlled that its members never realized they were prisoners until the very moment their captors decided they were no longer needed. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire community becomes complicit in its own destruction? What we're about to uncover challenges everything we think we know about family loyalty and the lengths people will go to protect their bloodline. Deep in the fog-shrouded valleys of eastern Kentucky, where county records still bear inexplicable gaps and local historians refuse to discuss certain surnames, lies the disturbing legacy of the Ashford family. What began as a routine genealogical investigation in 2003 uncovered a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation and ritualistic control that spanned nearly 8 decades, transforming an entire mountain community into willing participants in their own subjugation. The Ashfords first appeared in Crow's Hollow in 1921, arriving during the harshest winter in regional memory when existing families faced starvation and desperation. Unlike typical mountain settlers who struggled to establish themselves, the Ashfords possessed an uncanny ability to identify exactly what each family needed most desperately, appearing at their doorsteps with solutions that seemed too good to refuse. Samuel Ashford, the family patriarch, carried himself with the bearing of an educated man, though no records exist of his background prior to that winter. His wife, Constance, possessed an otherworldly beauty that locals described as both mesmerizing and unsettling. Their 3 children, ages ranging from 8 to 14, displayed a maturity and intelligence that made longtime residents uncomfortable, as though they understood adult conversations and motivations with disturbing clarity. What distinguished the Ashfords from other influential mountain families was their methodology. Rather than using violence or economic coercion, they employed what modern psychologists would recognize as sophisticated behavioral conditioning techniques. They began by establishing themselves as indispensable problem solvers, arriving precisely when families faced their greatest crises with resources and knowledge that defied explanation. When the Morrison family's youngest child developed what appeared to be tuberculosis, Samuel Ashford appeared with medicines that cured the boy within days. When drought threatened the Mackenzie crops, Constance showed them irrigation techniques that not only saved their harvest, but tripled their yield. When the Hollowell mining operation faced dangerous cave-ins, the Ashford children demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict structural failures before they occurred. Each intervention created debt, gratitude, and dependency. Families who benefited from Ashford assistance found themselves increasingly unable to make decisions without consulting their benefactors. What began as voluntary consultation gradually evolved into compulsive deference, as community members discovered they felt anxious and uncertain when acting independently. The transformation accelerated when the Ashfords established what they called the Community Council in 1924. Ostensibly a democratic forum for collective decision-making, the council operated according to principles that subtly undermined individual autonomy. Members were encouraged to share their deepest fears, private conflicts, and family secrets during lengthy sessions that Constance facilitated with hypnotic skill. These sessions, held in the Ashford home's peculiarly designed basement, followed a ritualistic structure that participants later described as both comforting and disturbing. The room itself defied architectural logic, with curved walls that seemed to amplify and distort sound, creating an acoustic environment where whispered confessions could be heard clearly, while normal conversation became muffled and indistinct. During these gatherings, community members found themselves revealing information they had never intended to share. Private grudges, hidden resources, family weaknesses, and personal shames poured forth in detailed confessions that Constance recorded meticulously in leather-bound journals. Participants left these sessions feeling purged and cleansed, though many reported disturbing dreams and difficulty remembering exactly what they had disclosed. The Ashfords used this intelligence with surgical precision. They would approach families days or weeks after counsel sessions with solutions to problems that hadn't yet become public knowledge. A farmer whose wife was secretly considering leaving him would find Samuel at his door with advice about improving marital communication. A mother worried about her son's increasing violence would discover Constance waiting in her kitchen with herbal remedies and parenting techniques. This prescient helpfulness created an atmosphere of supernatural omniscience around the family. Residents began to believe the Ashfords possessed genuine psychic abilities, a reputation the family carefully cultivated without explicitly claiming. They would make casual predictions about weather patterns, market fluctuations, and community events that proved remarkably accurate, though investigators later discovered these predictions were based on systematic observation and manipulation rather than supernatural insight. By 1930, the Ashfords had achieved something unprecedented in Appalachian social dynamics: voluntary subjugation of an entire community. Families competed for their attention and approval, offering increasingly valuable tributes in exchange for guidance and protection. Children were sent to work in the Ashford household as a privilege rather than an obligation. Adults sought permission for major life decisions, from marriage to property purchases to naming their children. The family compound, built with labor donated by grateful community members, grew into an imposing structure that dominated the valley's landscape. The main house featured a distinctive tower that provided visual oversight of every home and business in Crow's Hollow. From this vantage point, the Ashfords maintained constant surveillance, documenting the daily routines, relationship dynamics, and behavioral patterns of every resident. What made their control particularly insidious was its voluntary nature. Unlike other mountain families who ruled through fear and violence, the Ashfords created a system where subjugation felt like salvation. Community members genuinely believed their dependence on the family was beneficial, even necessary for their survival and prosperity. They had been gradually conditioned to view independent thinking as dangerous and selfish, while submission to Ashford wisdom was presented as virtue and community responsibility. The psychological architecture reached its peak during what locals called the gratitude ceremonies, elaborate monthly rituals where families publicly acknowledged their debts to the Ashfords. These events, held in a circular clearing surrounded by 13 oak trees, involved complex liturgies that blended elements of Christian worship with practices that seemed to predate European settlement. Participants would kneel in concentric circles around the Ashford family, reciting formulaic expressions of thanks while offering symbolic gifts representing their most valued possessions. The ceremonies concluded with what Constance termed the renewal, a process where each family publicly committed to continued service and loyalty for the coming month. Those who participated reported feeling spiritually cleansed and emotionally fulfilled, though former residents who escaped the valley years later described a profound sense of violation and loss of self that persisted for decades. The Ashford children, now adults with families of their own, served specialized functions in the family's control system. David, the eldest, managed what they euphemistically called education services, operating a school that taught local children academic subjects alongside techniques for emotional regulation and community service. Children who attended his classes returned home with enhanced abilities to detect adult emotions and an instinctive understanding of how to provide comfort and support to stressed family members. Margaret, the middle child, oversaw health and wellness, establishing herself as the valley's primary medical authority. Her treatments combined traditional mountain remedies with psychological techniques that created profound emotional dependence. Patients who received her care found conventional medicine ineffective afterward, as though their bodies had been fundamentally altered to respond only to her specific interventions. Thomas, the youngest, managed spiritual guidance, conducting religious services that gradually replaced traditional Christian worship. His sermons emphasized themes of collective responsibility, the dangers of individualism, and the sacred nature of family and community bonds. Under his influence, residents developed an almost mystical attachment to Crow's Hollow itself, feeling physically ill when traveling beyond the valley's boundaries. The system's sustainability depended on continuous recruitment of new families to replace those who died or occasionally managed to escape. The Ashfords developed sophisticated techniques for identifying vulnerable outsiders, particularly families facing economic hardship or personal crises. They would appear in neighboring communities as concerned citizens, offering assistance, gradually drawing desperate families into their web of dependency. What federal investigators later found most disturbing was the multi-generational nature of the operation. Children born into the Ashford-controlled community were raised with no concept of personal autonomy or individual rights. They understood themselves as components of a larger organism, valuable only insofar as they contributed to collective well-being as defined by the Ashford family. These children, when they reached adulthood, became the most effective agents for recruiting new families, as their genuine belief in the system's benefits made them convincing advocates. The Ashford legacy finally came to light when a fire destroyed much of the main compound in 1999, revealing hidden chambers containing decades of detailed surveillance records, psychological profiles, and strategic plans for expanding their control to neighboring valleys. The documents described methodologies for identifying psychological vulnerabilities, techniques for inducing emotional dependency, and long-term strategies for creating what they termed sustainable submission. Most chilling were the journals kept by successive generations of Ashford children detailing their training in manipulation techniques from early childhood. These records revealed that the family had developed a systematic approach to producing psychologically sophisticated individuals capable of reading, understanding, and exploiting human emotional needs with scientific precision. Today, Crow's Hollow stands largely abandoned, its remaining residents scattered to other communities where they struggle to adapt to normal social relationships. Mental health professionals who have worked with former residents describe a consistent pattern of learned helplessness, difficulty making independent decisions, and persistent anxiety when separated from authority figures. The few elderly survivors who agree to discuss their experiences describe the Ashford period with profound ambivalence. While they acknowledge the psychological manipulation and loss of autonomy, many admit to feeling more secure and purposeful during those years than they have ever felt since. They speak of a sense of belonging and meaning that conventional society has never provided, suggesting that the Ashfords had identified and exploited fundamental human needs that mainstream communities often fail to address. The Ashford case challenges our understanding of power, autonomy, and human nature itself. It demonstrates how sophisticated psychological manipulation can create systems of control that feel like liberation to those trapped within them. The family's methodology revealed uncomfortable truths about human vulnerability and the ease with which individuals can be conditioned to surrender their independence in exchange for security and purpose. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the Ashford system worked precisely because it fulfilled genuine human needs for community, purpose, and belonging, even as it systematically destroyed the capacity for independent thought and self-determination. Their legacy serves as a warning about the subtle dangers of surrendering individual autonomy, even to seemingly benevolent authorities who promise protection and prosperity in exchange for compliance. In the end, the Ashfords created a perfect prison, one where the inmates genuinely believed they were free and where the guards were as trapped as their prisoners, in a system that perpetuated itself through the willing participation of its victims. What happens when an entire community becomes willing participants in their own psychological enslavement? The answer lies buried in the fog-shrouded hollows of eastern Tennessee, where county records still contain deliberate omissions and local genealogists refuse to trace certain bloodlines beyond the year 1923. The Meridian family's legacy represents one of the most sophisticated examples of multi-generational psychological control ever documented in Appalachian history. Unlike the violent mountain feuds that dominated regional narratives, the Meridians achieved absolute dominance through methods so subtle that their victims never recognized their captivity until it was far too late to escape. The family first appeared in Copper Ridge Valley during the harsh winter of 1889, arriving amid circumstances that local newspapers described as providential intervention. The region faced its worst economic crisis in decades following the collapse of three major mining operations, leaving nearly 400 families without income or prospects. Into this desperation stepped Jeremiah Meridian, a man whose background remained deliberately obscured, but whose resources seemed inexhaustible. Contemporary accounts describe Jeremiah as possessing an almost supernatural ability to identify individual vulnerabilities. He would arrive at struggling homesteads with precisely the assistance each family needed most desperately: medical supplies for the sick, seed for failed crops, or tools to replace those lost to creditors. These interventions appeared spontaneous, yet later analysis of surviving correspondence reveals a meticulous intelligence network that monitored every family's private struggles with disturbing precision. What distinguished the Meridian approach from typical charitable work was the psychological conditioning embedded within each act of assistance. Recipients found themselves subtly indebted not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. Jeremiah possessed an uncanny talent for arriving during moments of maximum desperation, creating associations between his presence and salvation that gradually rewired recipients' fundamental decision-making processes. The family's compound, constructed with voluntary labor from grateful community members, served as both residence and laboratory for advanced behavioral manipulation techniques. The main house featured a central meeting hall designed according to acoustic principles that enhanced the hypnotic quality of spoken words while creating subtle disorientation in listeners. Windows were positioned to maximize natural light during specific times of day, while hidden chambers beneath the foundation housed detailed files documenting the psychological profiles, fears, and desires of every resident in the valley. By 1895, the Meridians had established what they termed cooperative councils, ostensibly democratic forums for community decision-making that actually functioned as sophisticated indoctrination sessions. These gatherings followed ritualistic patterns designed to break down individual resistance and foster collective dependency. Participants would share personal struggles, family secrets, and private fears in what appeared to be mutual support groups, but were actually intelligence-gathering operations. The psychological architecture of these sessions was remarkably advanced for its era. Jeremiah's wife, Constance, possessed extensive knowledge of hypnotic techniques that she disguised as spiritual guidance. Participants would enter trance-like states during which they became susceptible to suggestions that felt like personal revelations. Through this process, community members gradually adopted belief systems that positioned the Meridian family as indispensable guardians of collective well-being. The most insidious aspect of the Meridian system was its voluntary nature. Unlike other mountain families who ruled through fear and violence, the Meridians created conditions where subjugation felt like liberation. Community members genuinely believed their increasing dependence on the family represented spiritual growth and social evolution. They competed for opportunities to serve the Meridians, viewing such service as privilege rather than exploitation. Central to this system was the family's school, established in 1897 under the direction of Jeremiah's eldest son, Marcus. The curriculum combined traditional academic subjects with what Marcus termed social harmony education, systematic instruction in emotional regulation, conflict resolution, and community service. Children learned to identify and report signs of family discord, independent thinking, or resistance to collective decisions. They developed profound emotional attachments to the Meridian family while gradually losing the capacity for autonomous thought. The school's most disturbing feature was its residential program, where selected children spent extended periods living with the Meridian family. These children, chosen for their intelligence and social influence, returned to their families as unwitting agents of psychological control. They had been subtly conditioned to promote Meridian interests while believing they were acting according to their own moral convictions. Religious indoctrination formed another crucial component of the family's control system. Constance established a theological framework that blended Christian terminology with concepts designed to justify absolute submission to family authority. She taught that the Meridians had been divinely appointed as shepherds of the community's spiritual development, and that questioning their guidance represented not just disobedience, but spiritual corruption. These religious services, held in a specially constructed chapel featuring unusual geometric proportions, created powerful emotional experiences that participants interpreted as divine communion. The combination of architectural design, carefully chosen music, and Constance's hypnotic speaking style produced altered states of consciousness that participants associated with religious ecstasy. These experiences created profound psychological dependency as community members became addicted to the emotional highs that only Meridian-led services could provide. The family's economic control complemented their psychological manipulation. Through a network of businesses, credit arrangements, and employment opportunities, they gradually gained ownership or influence over every economic resource in the valley. This control was exercised with remarkable subtlety. Families retained the illusion of independence while actually becoming completely dependent on Meridian-controlled systems for their survival. Perhaps most disturbing was the family's systematic documentation of their methods. Hidden archives discovered decades later revealed detailed psychological profiles of every community member, strategic plans for expanding their influence, and technical manuals for implementing behavioral modification techniques. These documents demonstrated that the Meridians understood their system as a replicable methodology that could be applied to other communities. The archive also contained correspondence with academics and researchers from major universities, suggesting that the Meridian experiment attracted attention from individuals studying crowd psychology, social control, and religious manipulation. While these external connections provided intellectual validation for their methods, they also helped refine techniques that became increasingly sophisticated over time. By 1910, the Meridians controlled approximately 800 individuals across 3 interconnected communities. Their influence extended beyond direct residents to include traveling merchants, visiting clergy, and government officials who had been gradually compromised through carefully orchestrated social interactions. The family had created a sphere of influence that operated like a sovereign territory within the broader governmental structure. The system's sustainability depended on continuous recruitment of new families to replace those who died or occasionally managed to escape. The Meridians developed elaborate techniques for identifying vulnerable outsiders, particularly families facing economic hardship, medical crises, or social isolation. They would appear as concerned neighbors, offering assistance, gradually drawing desperate families into their web of dependency through a process so gradual that victims rarely recognized what was happening. What made the Meridian legacy particularly dangerous was its multi-generational nature. Children born into the controlled community developed no concept of personal autonomy or individual rights. They understood themselves as components of a larger organism, valuable only insofar as they contributed to collective well-being as defined by the Meridian family. These individuals, when they reached adulthood, became the most effective agents for recruiting new families and maintaining social control. The Meridian system finally collapsed in 1941 when federal investigators, alerted by escaped community members, discovered the hidden archives and the full extent of the family's psychological manipulation. The investigation revealed not just local control, but connections to similar operations in other states, suggesting that the Meridians had been part of a larger network of individuals experimenting with techniques of mass psychological control. The aftermath proved almost as disturbing as the original system. Community members who had lived under meridian control for decades struggled to adapt to normal social relationships. Mental health professionals who worked with these individuals described consistent patterns of learned helplessness, difficulty making independent decisions, and persistent anxiety when separated from authority figures. Many former community members reported feeling lost and purposeless without the structured meaning that the Meridian system had provided. Today, Copper Ridge Valley remains largely abandoned, its former residents scattered to other communities where they continue to struggle with the psychological legacy of their experiences. The few elderly survivors who discuss their experiences describe the Meridian period with profound ambivalence. While they acknowledge the manipulation and loss of autonomy, many admit to feeling more secure and purposeful during those years than they have ever felt since. The Meridian case represents a disturbing example of how sophisticated psychological manipulation can create systems of control that feel like liberation to those trapped within them. Their methodology revealed uncomfortable truths about human vulnerability and the ease with which individuals can be conditioned to surrender their independence in exchange for security and meaning. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that the Meridian techniques were documented and preserved, suggesting that their methods could be replicated by others who discovered their archives. The family's legacy serves as a warning about the subtle dangers of surrendering critical thinking to charismatic authorities, even those who promise protection and prosperity in exchange for compliance. In the end, the Meridians created something far more dangerous than a simple criminal enterprise. They developed a reproducible system for manufacturing willing slaves who genuinely believed themselves to be free. Their legacy challenges our fundamental assumptions about freedom, autonomy, and the nature of human choice itself. Looking at the script writing guides and horror examples you've provided, I'll craft a story that hooks viewers immediately, builds tension throughout, and delivers on the promise of your title. Here's a story about a fictional Appalachian family that fits your video concept. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire bloodline becomes something more than human? Deep in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, the Grimm family didn't just survive the harsh mountain winters and economic hardships that claimed so many others. They thrived in ways that defied explanation, becoming something that local folks still whisper about in hushed tones when the fog rolls thick through the valleys. The Grimm legacy began in 1889 when Ezra Grimm arrived in what would become known as Devil's Backbone Ridge, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and an unsettling ability to predict exactly when someone would die. Within a decade, this single man had transformed from a penniless drifter into the most feared and respected patriarch in 3 counties, wielding influence that extended far beyond anything money or politics could buy. What made the Grimm family truly terrifying wasn't their violence, though violence certainly followed in their wake. It was their uncanny ability to know things they shouldn't know, to be places they couldn't possibly reach, and to exact revenge on anyone who crossed them with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Local newspapers from the period, preserved in the Kentucky State Archives, document a pattern of incidents surrounding the family that reads like something from a nightmare rather than historical record. The first documented evidence of the family's unusual nature appeared in the Pike County Gazette in 1891 when editor Thomas Whitmore wrote about Ezra Grimm's arrival in the region. According to Whitmore's account, Grimm had approached him personally to place a series of obituaries for 7 different men, all scheduled to run in the following month's edition. When Whitmore questioned why anyone would write obituaries for living people, Grimm simply smiled and said the dates were already set. Within 30 days, all 7 men had died in separate, seemingly unrelated accidents. But it was Ezra's children who truly elevated the family's reputation from merely unsettling to absolutely terrifying. Mordecai, his eldest son, possessed what locals called the seeing eye. Witnesses reported that during conversations, one of Mordecai's eyes would cloud over completely white, and he would begin speaking about events happening miles away, often describing crimes or secrets that the listener had never told another soul. Sarah Grimm, his only daughter, could allegedly kill livestock and even people simply by touching them with her bare hands, a power she demonstrated publicly on several occasions when the family felt disrespected. The youngest son, Caleb, developed what the family called the long reach. Multiple sworn testimonies from the period describe Caleb appearing simultaneously in different locations, sometimes separated by dozens of miles. A store clerk in Prestonsburg would swear he saw Caleb purchasing supplies at the exact same time a mine foreman in Pikeville was watching him intimidate striking workers. These weren't cases of mistaken identity. Both witnesses knew Caleb personally and could describe specific conversations and the distinctive scar across his left cheek. The Grimm family's method of territorial control was as systematic as it was supernatural. They divided Pike County into invisible districts, with each family member responsible for monitoring different areas through means that witnesses struggled to explain. Farmers would wake to find their crop fields had been walked through during the night, leaving behind footprints that led in impossible directions, up the sides of barn walls, across rooftops, and sometimes simply ending mid-field, as if the walker had vanished into thin air. More disturbing were the family's enforcement techniques. Those who crossed the Grimms didn't simply face violence or financial ruin. They faced psychological warfare that seemed to operate outside the boundaries of normal human capability. James Morrison, a local mill owner who refused to pay the family's protection fees, documented his experiences in a series of letters to his brother in Louisville. Morrison described weeks of torment where he would find his tools rearranged in his workshop every morning, despite locking all the doors, hear his deceased mother's voice calling his name from empty rooms, and discover that his reflection in mirrors would occasionally move independently of his actions. The psychological pressure invariably broke those who resisted. Morrison eventually not only paid the demanded fees, but signed over a portion of his mill to the family, claiming in his final letter that they have ways of reaching into a man's mind that no Christian soul should possess. The family's most chilling demonstration of power occurred during the winter of 1894, when a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Cross arrived in the region determined to cleanse the devil's influence from Pike County. Cross had built a reputation throughout Appalachia for confronting what he called mountain witchcraft, and had successfully driven several other unusual families from their territories through a combination of religious fervor and community organizing. Cross began holding revival meetings, specifically denouncing the Grimm family by name, calling them servants of darkness, and urging locals to stand against their influence. His sermons drew large crowds, and for the first time since the family's arrival, people began openly discussing resistance. The movement gained momentum when Cross announced he would lead a group of armed men to the Grimm homestead to perform an exorcism. The confrontation never took place. On the morning of the planned march, Cross was found in his room at the local boarding house, sitting upright in a chair facing the window. He appeared physically unharmed, but had aged decades overnight. His hair had turned completely white, deep wrinkles creased his face, and his eyes had taken on the cloudy appearance of advanced cataracts. Most disturbing of all, Cross was completely mute, capable only of making soft whimpering sounds when approached. The town doctor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, documented Cross's condition in her medical journal, which was later acquired by the University of Kentucky's folklore collection. According to Rodriguez, Cross remained in this state for exactly 13 days, during which time he would occasionally write notes with shaking hands. These notes, all preserved in the university's archives, consisted of the same message repeated hundreds of times. They showed me how long forever is. On the 13th day, Cross simply vanished from his room. His clothes remained neatly folded on the bed. The door was still locked from the inside, and the only window was sealed shut and painted over. No trace of the Reverend was ever found, though locals reported seeing a figure resembling Cross wandering the mountains for years afterward, always at a distance, always alone, and always moving away from anyone who tried to approach. This incident marked the end of any organized resistance to the Grimm family's influence. By 1900, they had achieved a level of control over their territory that went far beyond normal criminal enterprise. They operated what amounted to a shadow government, with their own system of laws, punishments, and territorial boundaries that local authorities dared not challenge. The family's business interests expanded beyond traditional mountain enterprises. While other families in the region scraped by through farming, logging, and coal mining, the Grimms seemed to generate wealth through means that no one could quite identify. They owned no visible businesses, controlled no mining operations, and farmed no significant acreage, yet they consistently had more money than families who worked established enterprises. Some locals theorized that the family had discovered a hidden vein of gold or coal on their property, but geological surveys conducted in the 1920s found no valuable minerals in the area. Others suspected they were involved in illegal activities like bootlegging or robbery, but no evidence of such operations ever surfaced. The most persistent theory, whispered in taverns and church gatherings, was that the Grimms had made some kind of bargain with forces that existed outside normal understanding. This theory gained credibility from the family's apparent immunity to the hardships that plagued other mountain families. During the harsh winter of 1899, when record snowfalls isolated the region for months and several families starved to death, the Grimms not only survived but seemed to thrive. Neighbors reported seeing warm light glowing from their windows every night and smoke raising from their chimney, even when firewood was impossible to find. More mysteriously, visitors to their property during this period described finding fresh vegetables and meat on their table, despite the fact that nothing could grow in the frozen ground and all local livestock had either died or been slaughtered weeks earlier. The family's influence began extending beyond Pike County as the children reached adulthood and started families of their own. Rather than dispersing across the region like typical mountain families, the Grimms maintained an unusually tight clan structure. Children married within a carefully selected network of families, all of whom seemed to share certain unusual characteristics. These allied families began displaying similar abilities to predict deaths, influence events from a distance, and know information they shouldn't possess. By 1910, what locals called the Grimm Network encompassed parts of 5 counties across Kentucky and Virginia. Law enforcement officials from multiple jurisdictions reported coordination problems when investigating crimes in these areas, with witnesses frequently providing conflicting testimonies and evidence mysteriously disappearing from secure locations. Several sheriffs and federal marshals who attempted to build cases against family members suffered a series of personal tragedies, house fires, family illnesses, and fatal accidents that effectively ended their investigations. The family's most documented supernatural display occurred during the Pike County Fair of 1912, witnessed by over 300 people and recorded in multiple newspaper accounts. Mordecai Grimm had been accused of cheating during a poker game by a visiting businessman from Lexington. Rather than respond with typical mountain violence, Mordecai simply stared at the man and asked him to look into his eyes. According to the Lexington Herald's correspondent, who was present at the fair, the businessman began screaming almost immediately, claiming he could see his own death playing out in Mordecai's clouded eye. The man described in vivid detail how he would die in a train derailment exactly 6 months later, providing specific details about the weather, the location, and the other passengers who would be killed alongside him. The correspondent, Samuel Mitchell, was sufficiently intrigued to follow up on the prediction. His subsequent article, published after the businessman's death, confirmed that every detail had been accurate. The man died in a train derailment outside Frankfurt on the exact date Mordecai had predicted, under circumstances that matched the vision precisely. What made this incident particularly significant was that Mordecai had performed this demonstration deliberately in front of a large crowd, seemingly unconcerned about the attention it would bring. This suggested a level of confidence in the family's supernatural abilities and their immunity from consequences that bordered on arrogance. The Grimm family's reign of terror came to an abrupt end in 1918, though the circumstances surrounding their disappearance remain as mysterious as their decades of dominance. On October 31st of that year, every member of the extended Grimm clan, over 40 individuals spread across multiple properties, simply vanished overnight. Their homes were found empty but undisturbed, with meals still warm on tables and personal belongings left behind. The only clue to their fate was discovered by a postal worker making his rounds the following morning. Every Grimm property bore the same message, carved deeply into the wooden front doors. The debt is paid in full. No one could explain who had carved these messages or what debt they referred to. Local folklore suggests the family had finally encountered something more powerful than themselves, perhaps the very forces that they had bargained with decades earlier. Others believe they simply decided their work in the region was complete and relocated to new territory where they could start the process again. What remains certain is that their influence didn't end with their disappearance. Even today, over a century later, locals in Pike County speak of the grim legacy with a mixture of fear and respect. Strange incidents still occur in areas the family once controlled: unexplained deaths, people who know things they shouldn't, and the occasional sighting of figures that match descriptions of the original family members. The most chilling aspect of the grim story isn't what they did during their time in Pike County, but the possibility that they're still out there somewhere in some other isolated mountain community, building their influence and demonstrating that in the deepest hollers of Appalachia, some families operate by rules that exist far outside the boundaries of normal human understanding. Looking at the script writing techniques and horror style from your examples, I'll craft a story that hooks viewers immediately with a disturbing discovery, builds tension through historical documentation, and delivers on the promise of an unbelievable Appalachian family. Here's a story about the fictional Ashford family. What would drive an entire family to systematically erase themselves from existence? In the winter of 1923, investigators discovered something in the ruins of the Ashford homestead that challenged everything they thought they knew about human nature. Scattered throughout the charred remains were dozens of mirrors, each one deliberately shattered, and beneath the floorboards lay a collection of photographs where every face had been meticulously scratched out. But it was what they found in the root cellar that made seasoned detectives resign from the case. 17 identical diaries, written in 17 different hands, all containing the exact same entries spanning 37 years. The Ashford family's reign of psychological terror began innocuously enough in 1886 when Cornelius Ashford arrived in the remote valley that would later bear his name. Unlike the typical mountain settlers who came seeking land or fleeing troubles elsewhere, Cornelius brought with him something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous: an understanding of the human mind that existed decades ahead of his time. Local records describe him as a man of unusual bearing, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. More unsettling were the accounts of his ability to predict what people would say before they spoke, and his uncanny knowledge of secrets that individuals had never shared with another soul. Within months of his arrival, Cornelius had acquired vast tracts of land through negotiations that left previous owners questioning their own memories of the transactions. They would approach him intending to refuse his offers, only to find themselves signing deeds and walking away with payments they couldn't recall agreeing to accept. The transformation was so gradual and so subtle that most didn't realize they'd been manipulated until years later, and by then, questioning the circumstances seemed both pointless and somehow frightening. What made Cornelius truly terrifying wasn't his land acquisition, but his systematic collection of what he called human essence. He maintained detailed files on every person within 50 miles of his property, documenting not just their habits and relationships, but their deepest fears, secret shames, and unconscious behavioral patterns. These files, discovered decades later in a hidden room beneath his house, revealed a level of psychological profiling that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic psychology until the 1940s. More disturbing still were his experiments in what he termed personality transplantation, detailed studies of how to gradually alter an individual's fundamental nature through carefully orchestrated experiences and social pressures. The true horror of the Ashford legacy became apparent with the birth of Cornelius's children. Rather than raising them as individuals, he treated them as extensions of a single consciousness, implementing a child-rearing philosophy that systematically erased their individual identities. From their earliest moments, the Ashford children were subjected to a regimen designed to create perfect psychological mirrors of their father. They were fed identical meals, wore identical clothing, and were never permitted to be alone or to develop personal preferences. Most chilling of all, they were required to practice what Cornelius called thought synchronization, spending hours each day reciting identical phrases until their speech patterns, mannerisms, and even their breathing became perfectly synchronized. By 1895, the Ashford children had grown into adults, but they remained so psychologically merged that visitors to the family property reported feeling as though they were speaking to a single person inhabiting multiple bodies. Sarah, Marcus, and David Ashford moved in perfect unison, completed each other's sentences with mechanical precision, and demonstrated an ability to coordinate complex activities without any apparent communication. Local physician Dr. Emmanuel Torres documented his observations of the siblings in a series of medical journals that were later suppressed by his university. According to Torres, the Ashford children exhibited no individual personalities whatsoever, responding to questions with identical phrasing and displaying emotional reactions that appeared rehearsed rather than genuine. The family's influence expanded through what they called adoption programs, though these bore little resemblance to conventional adoptions. The Ashfords would identify families in crisis, those struggling with poverty, illness, or social problems, and offer to take in their children temporarily to provide education and opportunities. Parents, desperate for their children's welfare, would agree to arrangements that initially seemed generous and beneficial. The children would return home periodically for visits, appearing well-fed, well-dressed, and remarkably well-behaved. What parents didn't realize was that their children were being subjected to the same psychological conditioning that had shaped the original Ashford siblings. These adopted children, once they reached adulthood, would establish their own households throughout the region, but they remained psychologically tethered to the Ashford family compound. They made life decisions based on subtle signals from their adoptive family, arranged marriages according to Ashford preferences, and raised their own children using modified versions of Cornelius's psychological techniques. By 1910, nearly 200 individuals across 3 counties were functioning as extensions of the original Ashford consciousness, creating a shadow network of influence that operated beneath the awareness of local authorities. The most documented example of the family's psychological manipulation occurred during the 1907 mining disaster at Copper Creek. When 17 miners were trapped underground following a cave-in, the community naturally turned to prayer and conventional rescue efforts. The Ashfords, however, approached the families of the trapped miners with an offer that seemed both generous and logical, They would use their resources and connections to organize the rescue effort, asking only that the families trust their judgment completely and follow their instructions without question. Desperate families agreed, and the Ashfords indeed succeeded in rescuing 15 of the 17 trapped miners, a remarkable achievement that earned them tremendous gratitude and respect throughout the region. What emerged years later was the horrifying truth that the Ashfords had deliberately caused the cave-in through strategic weakening of support timbers, creating the crisis specifically to position themselves as saviors. The 2 miners who died had been selected in advance because they had shown resistance to Ashford influence within their families. The rescue operation itself became a carefully orchestrated demonstration of Ashford power designed to create psychological dependency among the local population. Families who had been independent and self-reliant became convinced that they needed Ashford guidance to navigate future crises, setting the stage for decades of psychological manipulation. The family's control techniques evolved to encompass entire communities through what they called social architecture, the systematic manipulation of relationships and social structures to create desired outcomes. They would identify key individuals within communities, respected elders, successful merchants, influential women, and gradually alter these people's perspectives and behaviors through carefully planned interactions. A respected church elder might find himself advocating for positions he had previously opposed, but the shift would be so gradual and so seemingly logical that neither he nor his congregation would recognize the manipulation. The Ashfords understood that by controlling the people whom others looked to for guidance, they could direct the behavior of entire communities without anyone realizing they were being controlled. Perhaps the most sinister aspect of the Ashford operation was their use of what they termed emotional harvesting. They had discovered that intense emotions, grief, fear, love, desperation, could be deliberately triggered and then channeled for psychological manipulation. The family would create situations designed to generate specific emotional states in their targets, then offer comfort and guidance that seemed genuinely caring but actually served to increase psychological dependency. A widow struggling with grief might find herself invited to private counseling sessions where her pain was acknowledged and gradually redirected into gratitude toward the Ashford family. A young man facing financial ruin might be offered opportunities that solved his immediate problems while creating long-term obligations to his benefactors. The beginning of the end for the Ashford dynasty came in 1920 when Dr. Margaret Hensley, a psychiatrist from the University of Virginia, arrived in the region to study what she had heard described as unusual community psychology patterns. Dr. Hensley had been trained in the emerging field of abnormal psychology and possessed both the knowledge and the independence necessary to recognize the systematic manipulation that had been invisible to local observers. Her initial investigations revealed behavioral patterns among local residents that suggested widespread psychological conditioning, but the scope and sophistication of the manipulation far exceeded anything documented in contemporary psychological literature. Dr. Hensley's research took on an urgency when she discovered that several individuals in the region had attempted to leave the area permanently but had returned within weeks, unable to explain their decision to come back. These individuals displayed symptoms consistent with what would later be recognized as psychological conditioning, including anxiety when separated from familiar environments, difficulty making independent decisions, and a compulsive need to seek approval from specific authority figures. Most disturbing was her discovery that many long-term residents of the region had lost the ability to form independent memories, instead possessing collections of experiences that seemed partially artificial and heavily influenced by external suggestion. The confrontation between Dr. Hensley and the Ashford family began subtly, with the family attempting to subject her to their standard manipulation techniques. They invited her to dinner, offered her research assistance, and gradually tried to isolate her from external contacts while surrounding her with carefully selected local residents who could provide testimonials about the family's beneficial influence. However, Dr. Hensley's professional training allowed her to recognize these techniques as sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. More importantly, her documentation of the family's methods provided the first objective analysis of their operation, creating a record that could be shared with outside authorities. The family's response to Dr. Hensley's investigation revealed the true extent of their psychological control over the local population. Rather than attempting to discredit her findings through conventional means, they launched what can only be described as a campaign of psychological warfare. Local residents who had previously cooperated with her research suddenly became hostile and uncooperative. People who had shared disturbing experiences began denying that such events had ever occurred. Most chilling of all, Dr. Hensley began receiving visits from local children who would recite elaborate stories about dangerous outsiders who came to their community to spread lies and discord. The crisis reached its peak in the winter of 1922 when Dr. Hensley attempted to remove several children from what she had identified as an abusive situation. The children themselves resisted removal, insisting that they were happy and well cared for, but their psychological evaluations revealed severe conditioning and the complete suppression of individual personality development. When state authorities arrived to investigate Dr. Hensley's reports, they found a community that appeared peaceful and prosperous, with residents who spoke glowingly of the Ashford family's contributions to their welfare. However, trained investigators noted the unnatural uniformity of these testimonials and the robotic quality of many residents' responses to questions about their experiences. The final confrontation occurred on March 15, 1923, when a combined force of state investigators and federal agents arrived at the Ashford compound with warrants for the arrest of family members on charges of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. What they found defied explanation. The compound was empty, but showed signs of recent habitation. More disturbing was the discovery that the entire property had been systematically destroyed from within. Every mirror in the house had been shattered, every photograph defaced, and every document that might have contained personal information had been burned. In the root cellar, investigators found the 17 identical diaries that provided the only remaining record of the family's activities. These diaries, written by different family members and adopted children over nearly 4 decades, contained identical entries for every day, written in different handwriting styles, but expressing identical thoughts, observations, and plans. The final entry, dated March 14th, 1923, simply read, "The experiment concludes. Individual identity has been successfully eliminated. We return to the source. No trace of any Ashford family member was ever found, and despite extensive investigations, no evidence emerged to explain their disappearance or their ultimate fate. The aftermath of the Ashford investigation revealed the true scope of their psychological manipulation. Over the following months, residents throughout the region began experiencing what psychiatrists termed psychological decompression, the gradual return of suppressed memories and individual personalities. Many discovered that their memories of the previous decades contained significant gaps or inconsistencies. Others realized that major life decisions, career choices, marriages, residence locations had been made based on suggestions that they couldn't clearly remember receiving. Most disturbing of all were the residents who discovered that they had participated in activities they couldn't remember and had held beliefs that now seemed completely foreign to their fundamental nature. Today, the Ashford Valley remains largely uninhabited, though the reasons vary depending on who you ask. Official records cite economic factors and the lack of suitable employment opportunities. Local residents speak vaguely of the area feeling wrong or uncomfortable, though they struggle to articulate specific concerns. Mental health professionals who have studied the region note unusually high rates of anxiety disorders and memory problems among people who lived in the area during the Ashford period. Most tellingly, several individuals who attempt to visit the former Ashford property report experiencing disorientation, false memories, and an overwhelming compulsion to leave immediately. The case of the Ashford family represents one of the most extensively documented examples of systematic psychological manipulation in American history, yet it remains largely unknown outside of specialized academic circles. Some researchers suggest that the family's techniques were so far ahead of their time that contemporary society lacked the vocabulary and conceptual framework necessary to fully understand what had occurred. Others believe that the scope of the manipulation was so extensive and so successful that most evidence of their activities was systematically suppressed or destroyed. What remains certain is that in the remote valleys of Appalachia, an entire community spent nearly 4 decades under the control of individuals who had discovered how to completely erase human individuality, leaving behind only the haunting question of whether true recovery from such manipulation is ever truly possible. What happens when an entire bloodline becomes something fundamentally inhuman, yet continues to operate within the boundaries of civilized society? The case of the Kenmore family of eastern Kentucky presents one of the most meticulously documented examples of generational transformation that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The Kenmore lineage first appeared in historical records in 1894 when Silas Kenmore purchased extensive property in what is now Carter County, Kentucky. Unlike typical mountain settlers who arrived with possessions and documentation, Kenmore emerged with neither personal history nor verifiable origins. Local property records indicate he paid for 2,400 acres of mountainous terrain with gold coins bearing mint marks from facilities that ceased operation decades before his birth. When questioned about this discrepancy by the county clerk, Kenmore reportedly smiled and stated that, Time moves differently in the deeper hollows. What distinguished the Kenmore acquisition from standard land purchases was the methodical precision with which Silas selected his territory. Rather than choosing fertile valleys or areas with obvious natural resources, he acquired a seemingly random collection of ridges, cave systems, and rocky outcroppings that formed an intricate pattern when viewed from above. Geological surveys conducted in the 1960s revealed that these parcels, when connected, created a perfect geometric shape that aligned with underground water sources and mineral deposits in ways that defied coincidental explanation. The transformation of the Kenmore bloodline began almost immediately upon settlement. Local physician Dr. Marcus Whitfield documented the family's unusual characteristics in a series of medical journals that were later acquired by the University of Kentucky's folklore collection. According to Whitfield's observations, the Kenmore children exhibited physiological traits that appeared to develop independently of normal human genetics. Their bones displayed unusual density, their muscle tissue contained fiber structures not found in typical human anatomy, and their nervous systems showed responsiveness to electromagnetic frequencies that ordinarily lie outside human perception. Most disturbing were Whitfield's notes regarding their pain tolerance and healing capabilities. The Kenmore children could sustain injuries that would incapacitate normal individuals, yet continue functioning without apparent discomfort. Cuts that should have required surgical intervention would close within hours, leaving no scarring. Burns that penetrated to bone tissue would regenerate completely within days, often displaying skin texture and coloration that appeared more resilient than the original tissue. The family's influence over their neighbors developed through what contemporary observers described as gravitational attraction. Rather than actively seeking to dominate local communities, the Kenmores seemed to naturally draw people into their orbit through a combination of practical assistance and psychological magnetism. They possessed an uncanny ability to appear precisely when their neighbors faced crises, offering solutions that were both effective and somehow exactly tailored to each individual's psychological vulnerabilities. During the economic depression of 1897, when local families faced starvation, the Kenmores established a distribution system that provided food, clothing, and medical care to anyone in need. However, recipients of this assistance reported subtle but persistent changes in their thinking patterns and decision-making processes. Family patriarch Samuel Morrison documented in his diary that after accepting Kenmore aid, he found himself making choices that seemed logical at the time, but later appeared completely contrary to his fundamental values and long-term interests. The Kenmore Educational Initiative, established in 1902, provided the most comprehensive evidence of the family's systematic approach to psychological conditioning. Rather than operating a traditional school, they created what they termed development centers, where local children received instruction in subjects that extended far beyond conventional curriculum. Students learned advanced mathematics, natural sciences, and what were described as awareness exercises that taught them to perceive environmental details invisible to most adults. Former students who left the region in adulthood consistently reported enhanced cognitive abilities, but also disturbing psychological side effects. They demonstrated exceptional pattern recognition skills, could detect subtle changes in human behavior and emotional states, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns and natural disasters. However, they also suffered from chronic insomnia, required unusually specific dietary requirements, and experienced severe anxiety when separated from mountainous terrain for extended periods. The most troubling aspect of Kenmore education was what graduating students called the understanding. This appeared to be a form of knowledge or awareness that fundamentally altered their relationship with reality. Students who achieved the understanding could no longer form meaningful relationships with individuals outside the Kenmore influence sphere. They reported feeling as though they existed partially outside normal time and space, experiencing events before they occurred, and remembering conversations that had not yet taken place. Dr. Eleanor Morrison of the University of Louisville conducted a comprehensive psychological study of former Kenmore students in 1934. Her findings, which were immediately classified by federal authorities, indicated that subjects displayed brain activity patterns unlike any previously documented in medical literature. Neurological scans revealed areas of their brains had developed entirely new neural pathways, creating cognitive capabilities that existing psychological frameworks could not explain or categorize. The industrial applications of Kenmore influence became apparent during World War I, when the family established a series of manufacturing facilities that produced materials crucial to the war effort. Despite being located in remote mountain areas with no obvious logistical advantages, these facilities achieved production efficiency rates that exceeded urban industrial centers by margins that military engineers declared impossible. Workers at Kenmore facilities could maintain peak performance for extended periods without fatigue, required minimal supervision, and demonstrated coordination abilities that allowed them to operate complex machinery with precision that bordered on telepathic. Government investigations into Kenmore industrial operations uncovered organizational structures that defied conventional management theory. Workers functioned not as individuals following directives, but as components of a larger system that seemed to operate according to principles more biological than mechanical. Production decisions were made not through hierarchical command structures, but through a form of distributed intelligence, where information flowed seamlessly between all participants simultaneously. The most extensively documented example of Kenmore collective behavior occurred during the 1918 influenza pandemic. While surrounding communities experienced mortality rates exceeding 30%, areas under Kenmore influence reported no deaths from the disease. Medical professionals who investigated this anomaly discovered that local residents had developed immunity not through exposure or vaccination, but through what appeared to be deliberate biological adaptation orchestrated by the Kenmore family. Federal health officials documented cases where Kenmore-influenced individuals could transfer their immunity to others through direct physical contact. More unsettling were reports that this immunity came with psychological side effects. Protected individuals began displaying behavioral synchronization, making similar decisions simultaneously despite having no communication with each other. They developed identical food preferences, sleep patterns, and even speech patterns, as if their exposure to Kenmore protection had fundamentally altered their individual autonomy. The agricultural innovations introduced by the Kenmore family, demonstrated their ability to manipulate biological systems on a macro scale. Beginning in 1925, they established experimental farms that produced crop yields 3 times greater than those achieved by conventional methods. These results were accomplished not through improved seeds or fertilizers, but through what they described as cooperative cultivation, where plants, soil organisms, and human caretakers functioned as an integrated ecosystem. Visiting agricultural scientists observed that Kenmore farms operated according to principles that violated established understanding of plant biology and soil chemistry. Crops grew in patterns that suggested communication between individual plants, with resource distribution and growth timing coordinated across entire fields. Soil analysis revealed microbial communities that had evolved symbiotically with plant root systems in ways that created closed-loop nutrient cycles, requiring no external inputs. Most remarkably, Kenmore agricultural workers appeared to communicate directly with the biological systems they tended. They could predict crop diseases weeks before symptoms appeared, identify optimal harvesting times without testing equipment, and guide plant growth patterns through methods that agricultural experts could observe but not replicate. The theological implications of Kenmore influence became apparent through their relationship with local religious institutions. Rather than establishing their own church or opposing existing denominations, they infiltrated established congregations and gradually transformed religious practices from within. Ministers who accepted Kenmore guidance began incorporating elements into their sermons that, while superficially consistent with traditional doctrine, fundamentally altered the psychological and spiritual framework of their congregations. These modified religious practices emphasized collective consciousness over individual salvation, promoted the concept of human potential as unlimited by physical constraints, and suggested that traditional boundaries between life and death were artificial constructs that could be transcended through proper understanding. Congregation members who embraced these teachings reported mystical experiences that included communication with deceased relatives, prophetic visions, and the ability to influence physical reality through concentrated mental effort. The final documented phase of Kenmore influence began in 1943 when family members announced what they termed the culmination. Over a period of 6 months, all individuals who had been significantly influenced by the Kenmore family began experiencing what witnesses described as a form of collective transformation. They exhibited increased physical coordination, enhanced cognitive abilities, and psychological changes that effectively eliminated individual personality differences. By early 1944, the entire Kenmore-influenced population had achieved what appeared to be a form of shared consciousness. They functioned as a single entity, distributed across hundreds of individual bodies, capable of coordinating complex activities across vast distances without any form of technological communication. Government observers noted that this collective entity possessed problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the sum of its individual components, demonstrating intelligence that operated according to principles fundamentally different from human cognition. The disappearance of the Kenmore Collective occurred gradually between 1945 and 1950. Rather than vanishing suddenly, individuals began departing the region in small groups, claiming they had received opportunities elsewhere. However, investigations revealed that none of these individuals could be traced to their supposed destinations. They simply ceased to exist in any verifiable form once they left the immediate area of Kenmore influence. The final Kenmore family member, a woman identified only as the coordinator, was last seen in 1951 by a traveling preacher who described her as appearing simultaneously ancient and ageless. According to his account, she explained that the family's work in the region was complete and they were moving to locations where the conditions are optimal for the next phase. When asked what this meant, she reportedly replied that humanity is still learning what it can become, and we are simply teachers preparing the curriculum. Today, the former Kenmore territories remain largely uninhabited, despite being officially available for development. Geological surveys continue to identify unusual mineral formations and underground structures that suggest artificial construction, though no equipment has successfully penetrated deep enough to provide conclusive evidence. Local wildlife displays behavioral patterns that biologists cannot explain, including collective migration patterns that seem to serve no evolutionary purpose and communication methods that appear to transcend species boundaries. Most significantly, individuals who spend extended time in former Kenmore territories report subtle but persistent changes in their cognitive abilities and perceptual awareness. While these changes are generally regarded as beneficial, they inevitably create psychological distance between affected individuals and normal human society. These people find themselves increasingly drawn to return to the mountains, often abandoning successful careers and relationships to pursue undefined goals in the remote hollows where the Kenmore family once demonstrated that the boundaries of human potential may be far more flexible than conventional wisdom suggests. The question that continues to challenge researchers is whether the Kenmore family represented an evolutionary advancement, a supernatural phenomenon, or something that transcends traditional categories entirely. What remains certain is that their systematic transformation of human consciousness and capability provides compelling evidence that our understanding of human nature itself may be fundamentally incomplete, and that in the deepest recesses of Appalachia, forces continue to operate that could reshape the future of human existence in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. In the shadowed hollows of eastern Kentucky, where mist clings to ancient ridgelines like ghostly fingers, lies a story that historians have deliberately buried beneath layers of classified documents and deliberate omission. The Grimm family of Devil's Backbone Ridge didn't just terrorize their neighbors, they fundamentally altered the very nature of reality in their isolated domain, leaving behind a legacy so disturbing that federal authorities maintain an active monitoring station disguised as a weather facility to this day. But before we delve into the horrifying specifics of what the Grimms accomplished during their century-long reign of terror, you need to understand something crucial. This isn't just another tale of mountain feuds or backwoods brutality. What happened on Devil's Backbone Ridge between 1847 and 1952 represents something far more sinister, a systematic campaign to breach the barriers between our world and something that should have remained buried in the deepest caverns beneath Appalachia. The story begins with Silas Grimm's arrival in the winter of 1847, though arrival might not be the correct term. Local Cherokee who still hunted in those mountains claimed Silas simply emerged from the morning cave, a limestone cavern system that tribal elders had sealed with stones and warnings centuries before European settlement. What's documented is that Silas appeared during the worst blizzard in recorded Kentucky history, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and speaking a dialect of English that linguistic experts later described as archaic beyond explanation, as if he'd learned the language from sources that predated its modern evolution by several hundred years. Within 6 months, Silas had acquired nearly 1,000 acres of the most remote and supposedly worthless land in the region. The previous owners, the Morrison family, had vanished one spring night, leaving behind a homestead with meals still warm on the table and livestock that refused to enter their barn ever again. Local authorities attributed their disappearance to bears or possibly hostile raiders, but hunters who ventured near the abandoned Morrison property reported finding strange symbols carved into trees, symbols that seemed to hurt the eyes when looked at directly and caused hunting dogs to whimper and refuse to continue tracking. Silas Grimm was described by those few who encountered him as unnaturally tall, with fingers that seemed too long for his hands and eyes that reflected light, like an animal's in darkness. More disturbing were the accounts of his speech patterns. Reverend Joshua Hartwell, who performed what would be the last wedding ceremony in the region for nearly a decade, wrote in his private journal that Silas spoke as if he were translating his thoughts from another language entirely, often pausing mid-sentence as if listening to whispered instructions only he could hear. The Grimm compound began construction immediately, but not in any conventional sense. Rather than clearing land and building from the ground up, Silas appeared to be excavating, following some predetermined pattern that led deep into the ridge itself. Workers hired from neighboring counties reported that the job sites changed overnight, as if extensive digging had occurred between shifts, yet no one ever saw Silas or his small crew working after sunset. More disturbing were the sounds that echoed from the construction areas, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from far beneath the earth, and occasionally what sounded like responses, answering rhythms that originated even deeper underground. By 1850, the first generation of Grimm children had been born, though born might be too generous a term for what witnesses described. Martha Caldwell, the region's only midwife, attended the births of all 5 Grimm offspring and left behind detailed notes that were later seized by federal authorities. According to fragments of her journal that survived, the Grimm children possessed unusual physical characteristics from birth: additional joints in their fingers, pupils that dilated independently of light conditions, and an apparent ability to remain completely motionless for hours at a time, as if they didn't require regular breathing. The children, Abel, Cain, Lilith, Ezekiel, and Magdalene, grew rapidly, reaching adult size by age 12 and displaying intellectual capabilities that unnerved their rare visitors. They spoke in unison when addressing outsiders, finishing each other's sentences with such precision that it appeared rehearsed, though witnesses insisted the conversations were spontaneous. More troubling was their apparent knowledge of events occurring in distant locations. They accurately described the outcomes of elections in Washington before news could possibly have reached their isolated ridge, and they possessed detailed knowledge of their neighbors' private affairs despite never leaving the family compound. The true nature of the Grimm family's influence became apparent through what locals began calling the borrowing. Starting in 1852, families throughout the region began experiencing a peculiar phenomenon. Their children would disappear for periods ranging from several hours to several days, only to return with no memory of where they'd been, but possessing new knowledge and skills they couldn't possibly have acquired on their own. A blacksmith's son returned knowing Latin. A farmer's daughter came back speaking fluent Cherokee, despite never having contact with tribal members. Most disturbing of all, these children returned with an inexplicable compulsion to defend the Grimm family against any criticism or investigation. Dr. Samuel Moorcock, a physician from Lexington who traveled to the region in 1854 to investigate reports of unusual childhood illnesses, documented 17 cases of what he termed sympathetic knowledge acquisition. Children who had experienced borrowing episodes displayed identical scarring on their palms, small, precise cuts that formed symbols matching those found carved into trees around the Grimm property. When Dr. Moorcock attempted to interview the affected children, they would fall into synchronized seizures, speaking in unison about the deep teachings and the old promises until their parents physically removed them from his presence. The borrowing escalated over the following decade, but the borrowed children weren't the only ones changing. Parents noticed that livestock began producing offspring with unusual characteristics: cattle with too many ribs, pigs born with patches of human-like skin, chickens that laid eggs containing perfectly formed miniature hands instead of yolks. Wells that had provided clean water for generations suddenly produced liquid that tasted of copper and left dark stains on everything it touched. Most unsettling of all, the region's death rate plummeted to nearly zero, not because people were healthier, but because those who should have died from injury or illness seemed to linger indefinitely in states that couldn't properly be called living. By 1863, the Civil War provided perfect cover for the Grimm family's most ambitious undertaking. While Kentucky officially remained neutral, Devil's Backbone Ridge became a staging ground for activities that had nothing to do with the conflict between North and South. Military deserters from both armies began arriving at the Grimm compound, drawn by promises of sanctuary and purpose. What they found instead was conscription into a different kind of service entirely. Captain William Thorne of the Union Army led a reconnaissance mission to investigate reports of irregular activity in the region. His final dispatch, recovered decades later from a hidden cache in a church basement, described approaching the Grimm property during what appeared to be a massive construction project. Hundreds of men worked in perfect synchronization, excavating what Thorne estimated to be a circular pit nearly a quarter-mile in diameter and descending far deeper than his field glasses could penetrate. The workers moved with mechanical precision, never stopping to rest or eat, and when Thorne attempted to approach for a closer inspection, he discovered that many of the laborers were men who had been reported killed in battles hundreds of miles away. The excavation project, which locals secretly called the Invitation, reached completion sometime in late 1865, coinciding with reports of seismic activity that extended far beyond what Kentucky's geology should have supported. The tremors followed no natural pattern, instead pulsing in rhythmic sequences that reminded witnesses of extremely slow heartbeats. More disturbing were the temperature changes. Areas within a 5-mile radius of the grim compound experienced sudden drops in temperature that could freeze standing water in July, followed by equally inexplicable heat waves that caused metal tools to become too hot to handle. The invitation served its purpose. In 1866, something answered. The first sign was the silence. Every natural sound within 10 miles of Devil's Backbone Ridge simply stopped. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight, not dead but motionless, their eyes fixed on the grim compound with expressions of what witnesses described as worship. Insects ceased their movements so completely that spider webs remained undisturbed for months. Even the wind seemed to avoid the region, creating a zone of atmospheric stillness that made voices carry impossible distances and caused echo effects that suggested the landscape itself had become hollow. What emerged from the excavation was never directly observed by outside witnesses, but its effects were undeniable. The Grimm family members themselves began changing in ways that challenged basic human anatomy. Their proportions shifted subtly but consistently, arms growing longer, necks extending, facial features rearranging themselves into configurations that retained human elements while suggesting something altogether different. Visitors who managed brief encounters described feeling intense vertigo when looking directly at any Grimm family member, as if their visual perception couldn't properly process what it was seeing. The borrowed children became permanent residents of the compound, though their families continued to receive letters written in their children's handwriting, describing lives and experiences that couldn't possibly be occurring in the isolated mountain settlement. These letters contained knowledge of scientific discoveries and historical events that wouldn't occur for decades, suggesting that whatever had answered the invitation operated according to temporal rules that differed significantly from linear time. Federal intervention began in 1871 when disappearances extended beyond the immediate region. Entire families traveling through Kentucky on their way to Western territories simply vanished along certain mountain roads, their wagons found empty but undisturbed, as if the occupants had simultaneously decided to abandon their possessions and walk into the wilderness. Investigation revealed that all disappearances occurred within a gradually expanding radius centered on Devil's Backbone Ridge. The government response was unlike anything in American history. Rather than sending conventional military forces, authorities assembled a team that included geologists, archaeologists, theologians, and individuals whose expertise remains classified to this day. The expedition, designated Project Restoration, established a base camp in 1873 with the stated goal of geological survey and mineral assessment. Their real purpose was to determine whether the Grimm family compound posed a threat to national security. Project Restoration's findings, partially declassified in 1987, paint a picture of systematic reality manipulation that challenged every assumption about the physical laws governing Appalachian geology. Instruments detected magnetic anomalies that indicated the presence of materials unknown to contemporary science. Temperature readings suggested the existence of chambers beneath the compound that maintained internal environments impossible according to thermodynamic principles. Most disturbing of all were the acoustic measurements. Recording equipment captured sounds originating from depths that exceeded the maximum possible extent of natural cave systems, suggesting that the excavation had accessed something that existed independently of Kentucky's geological structure. The project ended abruptly in 1874 when contact was lost with the entire research team. Their base camp was found perfectly preserved but empty, with all equipment still functioning and meals prepared but uneaten. The only evidence of what might have happened was a single photograph taken by the expedition's documenting specialist, an image showing what appeared to be the entire research team standing in formation around the grim compound's excavation site. But their poses and expressions were identical to those of the Grimm family members, suggesting that they had undergone the same transformation process that had claimed the borrowed children decades earlier. Following the loss of Project Restoration, federal policy shifted from investigation to containment. The region surrounding Devil's Backbone Ridge was quietly acquired through a complex series of land purchases and legal maneuvers that removed all private ownership within a 20-mile radius. Official records listed the area as unsuitable for development due to unstable geology and potential mineral contamination, but the true purpose was to establish a buffer zone around whatever the Grimm family had awakened. The containment strategy appeared successful for nearly 8 decades. The Grimm compound remained active but isolated, with monitoring stations positioned at strategic points to detect any expansion of their influence. Occasional reconnaissance missions confirmed that the family continued to exist in some form, though observers noted that distinguishing between individual family members became increasingly difficult as their physical characteristics converged towards something that retained human elements while suggesting a fundamentally different underlying structure. The end came suddenly in 1952 during what government records describe only as project closure. Details remain classified, but the outcome was undeniable. Devil's Backbone Ridge was found completely empty, with every structure associated with the Grimm compound simply gone. Not destroyed or abandoned, but absent, as if they had never existed. The excavation site was filled with solid rock that geological analysis confirmed was consistent with the ridge's original formation, suggesting that whatever had been accessed through the pit had been sealed away once again. Yet the story doesn't end with the disappearance of the Grimm family. The monitoring stations remain active, staffed by personnel who undergo psychological evaluation every 6 months and are rotated to different assignments every 2 years to prevent prolonged exposure to whatever residual effects linger in the region. Satellite imagery occasionally captures anomalies, geometric patterns in vegetation growth that suggest underlying structures, temperature variations that indicate subsurface activity, and most disturbing of all, formations of wildlife that move in synchronized patterns reminiscent of the borrowed children's behavior. Local residents in surrounding counties still report phenomena that suggest the Grimm legacy persists in subtle but persistent ways. Children born in the region display unusually advanced cognitive abilities and possess detailed knowledge of historical events they couldn't have learned through conventional education. Wells throughout eastern Kentucky occasionally produce water that tastes of copper and causes temporary disorientation in those who drink it. Most troubling of all are the dreams, Residents report shared nocturnal experiences featuring the same recurring imagery of vast underground chambers filled with figures that might once have been human, all moving in perfect synchronization while tending to something massive and patient that waits in the deepest darkness beneath Appalachia. The Grimm family of Devil's Backbone Ridge achieved something that historians prefer not to acknowledge. They successfully established contact with entities that exist outside our conventional understanding of reality. Their century-long experiment in bridging dimensions cost hundreds of lives and permanently altered the geological and metaphysical landscape of eastern Kentucky. Though their physical presence has vanished, the infrastructure they created, both visible and invisible, continues to function according to principles that government scientists admit they don't fully understand. What makes the Grimm legacy truly terrifying isn't just what they accomplished, but what they might have set in motion. The monitoring stations detect regular pulses of activity, suggesting that whatever was awakened in 1866 continues to operate beneath the mountains, growing stronger and more organized with each passing decade. The borrowed children's descendants carry genetic markers that appear in no other human populations, and their offspring display capabilities that suggest ongoing evolutionary pressure from an unknown source. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the growing evidence that the Grimm family's work was not unique. Similar patterns of unexplained disappearances, geological anomalies, and reality distortion have been documented in remote regions throughout Appalachia, suggesting that Devil's Backbone Ridge was just one node in a larger network of influence that spans the entire mountain range. The mist that rolls through these ancient valleys may conceal more than isolated communities. It might hide the remnants of humanity's first successful attempt to negotiate with forces that view our entire species as raw material for purposes we cannot begin to comprehend. In the deepest hollows of eastern Kentucky, where government satellites still detect faint but persistent signals emanating from supposedly empty ridgelines, something waits with the patience of geological time for the right conditions to resume the work that the Grimm family began. And on certain nights, when atmospheric conditions align in just the right way, residents throughout Appalachia report hearing the sound of synchronized digging echoing from far beneath their feet, as if massive excavation projects continue in chambers that exist outside the boundaries of our mapped world. In the fog-shrouded hollows of eastern Tennessee, where ancient Cherokee burial grounds give way to limestone caverns that echo with sounds no geologist can explain, the Ashford family established their dominion in 1863 with methods that would make even the most hardened mountain clans step back in silent fear. But what happened in Raven's Hollow between 1863 and 1934 wasn't just another tale of Appalachian violence. It was a systematic campaign to reshape reality itself, using techniques that predated European settlement by centuries. The first recorded mention of the Ashford name appears in a Confederate deserter's journal, discovered in 1987 during the renovation of an abandoned church basement. Private Joshua Whitman, fleeing from the Battle of Stones River, described encountering a family that lived as if the very mountains bent to their will. According to Whitman's increasingly erratic entries, the Ashfords offered him sanctuary in exchange for what they termed blood service, a commitment that would bind him to their household for 7 years. The journal ends abruptly with Whitman writing, "The children here age backwards." Sarah, who welcomed me as a girl of 12, now appears no older than 8. When I asked her mother about this impossibility, she smiled and said some gifts require careful tending. What makes this account particularly disturbing isn't just its supernatural implications, but the fact that subsequent investigations confirmed Whitman's basic observations about the family's unusual aging patterns. Death certificates filed in surrounding counties between 1870 and 1920 consistently list Ashford family members as dying at ages that contradict earlier documentation by decades. Mordecai Ashford, the family patriarch, appears on census records spanning 40 years, with his age remaining constant at 37, while his children are recorded as growing younger with each official count. The Ashford compound occupied a natural amphitheater in the mountains where 3 separate hollows converged, creating an acoustic phenomenon that allowed whispers spoken at the family's main house to be heard clearly at points nearly 2 miles away. But this geological curiosity became something far more sinister under the family's influence. Local Cherokee elders, in rare interviews conducted by folklorist Margaret Sims in the 1920s, described the area as a listening place where their ancestors had communicated with spirits dwelling beneath the earth. According to these accounts, the Cherokee had deliberately abandoned the site after a series of rituals went catastrophically wrong, leaving behind only warning markers that the first European settlers promptly ignored. Mordecai Ashford understood the significance of this location from the moment he arrived. Unlike other mountain families who struggled to carve out subsistence livings from the harsh terrain, the Ashfords immediately began construction of an elaborate underground complex that extended far beyond what practical needs would require. Neighbors reported hearing constant digging and hammering from beneath the earth, sounds that continued day and night without pause for rest or Sabbath observance. More unsettling were the rhythmic chanting and singing that echoed from these subterranean chambers, performances that seemed to involve far more voices than the family could possibly possess. The Ashford children, Sarah, Ezekiel, and Magdalene, became legendary throughout the region for abilities that transcended normal human limitations. They could navigate the treacherous mountain paths in complete darkness, communicate with wild animals with apparent fluency, and demonstrate knowledge of events occurring hundreds of miles away with uncanny accuracy. Local ministers initially attributed these gifts to divine favor, but their enthusiasm quickly soured when they witnessed the children's reactions to traditional Christian symbols and prayers. Reverend Thomas Mitchell, who attempted to bless the Ashford property in 1867, later wrote that the children recoiled from my cross as if it were molten iron, and when I began the Lord's Prayer, young Ezekiel began speaking the same words simultaneously, but in reverse order, creating a harmony so disturbing that I fled without completing the blessing. The family's influence over Raven's Hollow operated through what anthropologists would later recognize as a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation combined with genuine supernatural phenomena. The Ashfords never explicitly threatened their neighbors, but those who crossed them faced consequences that extended far beyond conventional human retaliation. Livestock belonging to families who opposed Ashford interests would be found arranged in perfect geometric patterns, unharmed but clearly moved by some intelligence that understood symbolic communication. Wells that had provided clean water for generations would suddenly produce liquid that tasted of copper and caused vivid nightmares in those who drank it. Most disturbing of all were the dreams themselves, shared experiences where entire families would find themselves standing in vast underground chambers, watching shadowy figures perform rituals around objects that hurt to look at directly. By 1875, the Ashfords had established what amounted to a shadow government throughout the region. Official records show that they held no formal political positions, yet decisions made by elected officials consistently aligned with Ashford interests in ways that defied logical explanation. County tax assessments were mysteriously adjusted in the family's favor, while properties belonging to their rivals were reassessed at values that forced immediate sale. Road construction projects were rerouted to provide the Ashfords with better access to remote areas while isolating families who had shown resistance to their influence. Most telling was the behavior of law enforcement officials who developed an apparently unanimous policy of avoiding the Ashford property entirely after a series of deputies sent to investigate minor complaints simply never returned. The disappearance of Deputy Marshal William Carson in 1878 marked a turning point in local attitudes toward the family. Carson, a veteran of the Union Army known for his methodical approach to investigations, had been sent to inquire about reports of unusual noise complaints emanating from the Ashford compound. His final telegram to his superiors, sent from the town of Elkmont the evening before his planned visit to Raven's Hollow, read, "Evidence suggests activities beyond normal family enterprise. Will investigate tomorrow morning and report findings by noon." Carson's horse returned 2 days later, saddle empty but containing a small wooden box filled with what appeared to be human teeth and a single sheet of paper covered in symbols that no linguist has ever successfully translated. The search for Carson revealed the full extent of the Ashford family's transformation of their mountain domain. What had initially appeared to be a simple homestead had grown into a complex network of structures that seemed to follow architectural principles unknown to conventional building practices. Houses connected to underground tunnels that formed patterns visible only from elevated perspectives, patterns that matched star charts from astronomical traditions predating European contact with the Americas by centuries. Gardens planted in spiraling configurations that created optical illusions, making distances appear shorter or longer depending on the viewer's position and the time of day. Most unsettling were the modifications to natural cave systems, where the Ashfords had somehow expanded existing limestone chambers into cathedral-sized spaces decorated with carvings that combined Cherokee spiritual symbols with European occult imagery in ways that suggested a synthesis of knowledge traditions that should never have intersected. The family's children continued to age in reverse throughout this period, a phenomenon that local residents learned to accept as one of many inexplicable aspects of Ashford existence. Sarah, who had appeared as a young woman when the family first arrived, now possessed the physical characteristics of a child barely entering adolescence, while maintaining the intellectual sophistication and emotional complexity of someone decades older. This temporal distortion affected not just the immediate family, but seemed to influence anyone who spent extended time on their property. Workers hired for construction projects would return home confused about how much time had elapsed, sometimes claiming that weeks of labor had occurred in the span of a single day, while others insisted that brief visits that had somehow consumed entire seasons. Local physicians documented cases of temporal displacement syndrome among individuals who had close contact with the Ashfords, though the medical establishment refused to acknowledge this as a legitimate condition. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, who maintained detailed records of his patients in Ravens Hollow, noted that certain families exhibited aging patterns that varied dramatically from normal human development. Children born after 1880 grew to physical maturity remarkably quickly, while adults seemed to maintain their prime years far longer than biological processes should allow. Most disturbing were the elderly residents who appeared to be growing younger, regaining physical capabilities they had lost to age while retaining memories and knowledge that spanned far longer than their apparent physical years should permit. The Ashford family's control over local wildlife represented another dimension of their supernatural influence that defied natural explanation. Hunters reported that animals throughout the region began exhibiting coordinated behaviors that suggested some form of centralized control. Deer would move in synchronized formations across multiple mountain ridges, while predatory birds gathered in numbers that created temporary eclipses of sunlight. Most unsettling were the wolves, which had been largely extinct in the region for decades, but began appearing in organized packs that seemed to follow specific routes between the Ashford property and locations throughout the surrounding mountains. These animals showed no fear of humans, but never attacked unless provoked, instead serving as what observers described as a wilderness intelligence network that kept the family informed of all movement throughout their expanded territory. The end of the Ashford Dominion came suddenly in 1934, though the circumstances surrounding their disappearance remain as mysterious as their original arrival. Federal agents investigating reports of unusual geological activity in the region found the entire Ashford compound abandoned, with evidence suggesting that the evacuation had been both immediate and comprehensive. Personal belongings remained in place, meals were found partially prepared, and livestock wandered unattended, yet there was no sign of the family members themselves. Most disturbing was the discovery that the extensive underground complex had been systematically sealed from within, using methods that would have required enormous amounts of concrete and steel that investigators could find no record of the family purchasing or transporting to the remote location. The official report classified the Ashford disappearance as a probable case of bootlegger activity disrupted by federal enforcement, but internal documents released decades later revealed a very different conclusion. Geological surveys detected massive subsurface changes that suggested controlled explosions or collapses had occurred throughout the underground network, creating voids that extended far deeper than any mining operation could account for. Temperature readings indicated that certain areas beneath the former Ashford property maintained consistently elevated heat levels that seemed to originate from unknown sources. Most puzzling were the electromagnetic anomalies that persisted for years after the family's departure, causing compass needles to spin freely and radio equipment to pick up transmissions that consisted entirely of rhythmic patterns resembling human heartbeats. Today, Raven's Hollow remains largely uninhabited despite its obvious natural beauty and strategic location. The Tennessee Department of Natural Resources maintains the area as a geological research preserve, but locals understand this designation as a polite fiction designed to keep curious visitors away from phenomena that state authorities prefer not to acknowledge. Hikers who venture into the region report experiences that echo accounts from the Ashford era. Time distortions that make day trips feel like expeditions lasting weeks, encounters with wildlife that display impossibly coordinated behaviors, and the persistent sensation of being observed by intelligences that remain just beyond direct perception. The few families that remain in the surrounding areas have developed what anthropologists describe as inherited avoidance behaviors, cultural practices passed down through generations that serve no apparent practical purpose but seem designed to prevent contact with whatever forces the Ashfords awakened or controlled during their 7-decade residency. Children are taught specific routes for traveling through the mountains that avoid certain landmarks, timing restrictions that prevent venturing near particular locations during specific phases of the moon, and recognition signals for wildlife behaviors that indicate the need for immediate retreat to safe areas. Perhaps most telling is the continued presence of temporal anomalies that suggest the Ashford family's work continues in their absence. Geological surveys conducted with modern equipment detect structural changes in the underground cave systems that occur according to patterns no natural process could explain. These modifications appear to be expanding the network of chambers and tunnels that the family originally created, as if some intelligence continues the project they began more than a century ago. Local residents report that the sounds of construction can still be heard emanating from beneath the earth on certain nights, rhythmic pounding and scraping that follows the same patterns documented during the Ashford era. The legacy of the Ashford family extends far beyond their direct influence over Raven's Hollow, representing perhaps the most successful example of reality manipulation ever documented in Appalachian history. Their techniques for controlling time, space, and biological processes appear to have been passed down through hidden networks that continue to operate throughout the region, waiting for conditions that might allow their forbidden knowledge to emerge once again from the shadows of the mountains where some secrets refuse to stay buried.